Here is your story. Maura Blacktusk arrived at Pruitt's ranch on a September morning 15 years ago with 2 bags, 1 broken boot, and a letter of recommendation from a man who had since moved to Colorado and could not be reached. Harlan Pruitt looked at her for a long moment, the small tusks, the green-brown skin, the hands already roughened beyond her age, and said, "Can you fix fence?" She said she could. He said, "Show me." She spent the next 4 hours replacing 100 feet of broken wire in the south field. He watched for the first 20 minutes, then went back to his coffee. By the time he returned, she was done and cleaning her tools. "Monday morning," he said. 6 o'clock. That was how it started. That was 15 years ago. Now she was 34, and the women at the Clover Bend feed store had developed a particular way of talking about her. Not mean, exactly. More like the gentle, sighing kind of observation that people make when they want to seem kind but cannot quite manage to stop. "Poor Maura," they would say, arranging seed packets or counting change. "She keeps the best fence line in 3 counties. Such a shame about the rest of it." The rest of it, they meant, was that nobody had asked her to marry them. Several people had told her why. Unprompted, with great sincerity, as if they were doing her a favor. She kept a tally on the inside of the tack room door. Not proposals, there were none of those, but explanations. 14 marks, scratched in with a nail. Around the 7th one she had stopped feeling the words and started collecting them the way a person collects stones from a riverbed. Interesting shapes. Smooth from use. She had lived enough to know that most things people said about her were more about themselves than about her. She let them say it. She went back to her work. The fence line was excellent. The horse arrived on a wet Tuesday in October. His name was Cassidy, according to the paperwork, though the men who delivered him used other words while loading him out of the trailer. He was 6 years old, 16 hands, the color of dark storm clouds moving fast over flat land. He came from a breeder in New Mexico who shook Harlan Pruitt's hand with both of his and smiled with all of his teeth, which should have been a warning. Within 2 weeks, Cassidy had knocked over the water trough, destroyed a section of the good fence, not Maura's section, but the one Danny Reardon maintained, which admittedly was not as solid, and put Danny himself in the hospital with 2 broken fingers and a lot of strong feelings about horses in general. Pruitt called in a trainer from Behar County. The trainer lasted 4 days and left without asking for his full payment, which told everyone what they needed to know. A second trainer came from farther away and lasted 6 days and wrote Pruitt a letter afterward with several professional observations, the most honest of which was buried in the 3rd paragraph and said simply, "This animal does not trust people. I am not certain what was done to him, but something was, and it left a mark, *." The ranch hands developed a system. They worked around Cassidy. They kept to the edges of his paddock. They spoke of him the way people speak of bad weather, something to be respected and avoided and waited out. Maura said nothing. This was normal. She said very little in general. She did her work. She fixed the fence. She fed the horses, the ones that would let her near, and she was the only one who had noticed, in the 3rd week of October, that Cassidy moved differently on cold mornings. She said nothing about this either. But she started watching him. Every morning before the other hands were fully awake, she stood at the far fence with her coffee going cold in her hand and she watched the horse. Not the way people watched him, not with fear or frustration or the particular human impatience that wants things resolved before breakfast, but the way she watched everything she was trying to understand. She watched how he moved when the wind came from the south. She watched the way his ears tracked sound before his body responded. She watched the way he stood apart from the other horses, not because he was mean, she thought, but because he had learned that closeness meant being caught off guard, and he was not willing to be caught off guard again. She understood this perfectly. 6 weeks passed. She did not go into his pen. She did not try to approach him over the fence. She simply showed up every morning and stood there and was a consistent, quiet thing in his world. Something that arrived and did not demand anything and left again. She was, she supposed, introducing herself. Cade Ellison arrived on a Tuesday in November with Wyoming plates on his truck and a bedroll in the back and the kind of quietness that is not shyness but something more deliberate. Harlan Pruitt hired him because 2 hands had left before winter and good workers were difficult to find. He was 36. He had the look of someone who had spent a long time outside and had made his peace with it. He shook hands with the other hands, learned their names, asked sensible questions about the property, and that first evening stood at the fence of Cassidy's paddock for 10 full minutes without saying anything, and then walked away. That night in the bunkhouse, one of the other hands told him about Mora. "She's been here forever," the hand said, not unkindly. "Good worker. Better than most. A little, you know." He made a vague gesture that was meant to convey a lot of things at once. "Good worker," Cade said. "Yeah. All right." He went to sleep. He noticed her the next morning. She was at the fence with her cold coffee and her quiet attention, and Cassidy was moving in circles in the far end of his paddock, agitated by something in the dark tree-line, and she was watching him the way Cade had seen very few people watch animals, not with an agenda, not with a solution already decided, just watching, gathering information, being patient in the specific and difficult way that patience requires when there is no visible reward for it yet. Cade stood where he was and drank his own coffee and said nothing. She did not know he was there. She would not have behaved any differently if she had. He went to work. He thought about what he had seen. He filed it where he filed things that mattered. The day she went into the round pen, it was a Wednesday in early December. Cold and clear, the sky the pale blue color of old denim. The other hands were busy. Pruitt was in town. She collected a lead rope from the tack room and walked to the round pen and went in. No whip. No aggressive posture. She moved to the center of the pen and stood with the rope coiled at her hip and her hands relaxed and her eyes slightly down. Not submissive, there was nothing submissive about Mora Blacktusk, but non-threatening. She made herself a thing that was simply present and not demanding anything. Cassidy saw her from 20 yards away and came at her hard. She turned sideways. She dropped her gaze to the dirt. She did not run. She did not flinch. She made herself smaller in all the ways that did not cost her anything essential, and she waited. The horse stopped 8 feet away. He did not know what to do with her. In his experience, whatever that experience had been, whatever had happened in New Mexico before the paperwork and the smiling men and the long trailer ride, the world worked in 2 directions. Things came at him and he drove them back. Things ran from him and confirmed his understanding of how dangerous everything was. This was the system. It had kept him intact. She was not following the system. She stood in the middle of his round pen and breathed slowly and kept her eyes soft and waited. Cassidy circled. Fast at first, throwing his head, warning her. She moved with him, keeping her body angled away, never blocking, never pressing. She gave him the whole pen. She asked for nothing. He circled slower. Then slower still. He stopped. He looked at her. She looked at the ground. Cade Ellison, who had walked over from the water trough on the pretense of checking a connection that did not need checking, was standing at the fence with his forearms resting on the top rail and was no longer pretending to be doing anything else. 20 minutes passed. 30. The cold morning sat still around the round pen. Cassidy walked to her. Not charging. Not testing. Walking, with his ears slightly forward and his neck stretched, and the particular curiosity of an animal that has encountered something it cannot categorize and has decided, against everything its past has taught it, to investigate. He put his nose against her chest. He blew out a long, slow breath. She raised one hand, very carefully, and placed it against the side of his jaw. She did not pet him the way people pet animals to make themselves feel good. She just held her hand there, steady, the way you would hold your hand against something you wanted to feel the warmth of. Her face did something then that was not quite a smile and not quite relief but was somewhere between the two, the expression of a person who has known something for a long time that nobody else believed and has finally been proven right. Not triumphant. Quieter than that. More like gratitude. She stood there in the cold with the most dangerous horse on the property breathing against her chest, and she was perfectly still, and she was more completely herself than she ever was anywhere else. Cade had not moved. He became aware, after a while, that his coffee was cold. He became aware that the other hands, 2 of them, had come up somewhere behind him and were watching with their mouths slightly open. He became aware that Harlan Pruitt's truck had come back early and Pruitt himself was standing at the far fence with his hat in his hands. Nobody spoke. After some time, Mora led Cassidy to the fence and tied the rope with a clean, efficient knot and ran her hand down his neck once, checking, not sentimental, and turned around. Cade was standing there. She had not known he was there. She saw it in his face when she looked up, that he had been there a long time, that he had seen everything. Most people, when you caught them watching, looked away or manufactured an excuse. He did neither. He looked at her the way she had been looking at the horse. Like she was the most interesting and most worth understanding thing in 40 miles. Like he had been taking notes. Her hand moved to the top rail of the fence. She held it there. She did not know what to do with that look. She was 34 years old and she had 14 marks on the tack room door, and she had learned, somewhere around Mark 7, that the safest thing was to want very little from people. She was good at her work and the work was enough, and the horse understood her, and that was a great deal more than most people had. That look was asking her to recalculate. She was not ready to recalculate. Horse needed someone patient, Cade said. His voice was even. Simple. No performance in it. She looked at the fence rail. At the grain of the wood. At the particular roughness of it under her fingers. Most things do, she said. The silence after that was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, that you carry around afterward, that shows up again in quiet moments without being invited. Pruitt cleared his throat from the far fence. Well, he said, which was the most Harlan Pruitt had ever communicated in one word. The other two hands started talking at the same time about things that had nothing to do with anything. The normal life of the ranch resumed around them. Mora untied Cassidy and walked him to the paddock and gave him water and went back to her list of 12 things and worked through them one by one for the rest of the day. She did not look for Cade. She did not avoid him either. She was simply a woman who had lived a long time inside herself and was not quite sure what to do with a door that someone had knocked on carefully and then waited outside without assuming they would be let in. The story that traveled through Clover Bend, through the feed store and the diner on Route 9 and at least 2 church committees, was about the horse. People said, "Did you hear about Mora Blacktusk? Tame, that wild horse at Pruitt's. The one that put Danny Reardon in the hospital. 6 weeks she watched it first. 6 weeks, and then she just walked in and stood there until it came to her, *. They shook their heads. They were genuinely impressed. A few of them were a little embarrassed, though they did not say so. The things they had said at the feed store felt different now, in the way that small meannesses always feel different once the person they were about has done something that makes the meanness obvious. They were glad it was a story about a horse. A horse was something they knew how to talk about. She put a 16th mark on the tack room door in January. Not an explanation. Not a name. Just a date, scratched in carefully with the same nail, in the same corner, with the same hand. Cassidy was eating well. He was letting the other hands near him now, slowly, on his terms, which were reasonable terms once you understood them. He was not a ruined horse. He had never been a ruined horse. He had been a horse that needed someone to be patient enough to show him that not everything that came toward him was coming to hurt him. Mora understood this because she had needed the same thing herself for a very long time. Cade Ellison was still at the ranch. He fixed things efficiently and asked sensible questions and watched everything with the same quiet attention. He had taken to bringing 2 cups of coffee out in the mornings. He left one on the fence post. He did not explain it. She did not ask him to. She picked it up. It was warm. She stood at the fence and drank it and watched the horses move in the early morning light, and the sky was the pale cold blue of winter, and Cassidy was near the far end of the paddock with his ears forward, calm, watching the tree line for nothing in particular, the way an animal watches when it is no longer afraid of what might come out of it. Mora Blacktusk held the warm cup in her cold hands and stood next to the men who had watched her without ever once asking her to be something different than she was, and she thought that patience was a strange and underrated thing. You put it in, quietly, day after day, with no guarantee of anything. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the thing you had been patient toward walked across the open ground and stood beside you and breathed slow and let itself be known.